is your video. And please, while the panelists are speaking, please make sure that your video and mic are off. I now introduce the Global Campaign of Education Vice President, Madeleine Zuninga, who will take us through today's event and moderate for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Pumza. Well, first of all, I would like to thank you all for being at this very important event for the Global Campaign of Education. As you know, SDG 4 is one of the SDGs that has been examined during the high-level political forum. And we are really very much concerned about people's consciousness on how important this SDG is for the fulfillment and achievement of almost all the other SDGs. We do believe that as much as all the human rights are interdependent, so are the SDGs, and mainly SDG 4, I'm sure you agree with me, is really perhaps the most important one of all of them, because its achievement leads to the achievement of the other SDGs. We cannot about stopping hunger and really eradicating hunger without quality education for very poor people that are usually left out. We cannot talk about health and nutrition without education. And I think we have all experienced that in this awful pandemic that we are still suffering. Many other issues that I am very glad to introduce one by one our speakers this morning, because they are going to highlight specific themes and issues related to SDG 4 and how they really gear to the fulfillment of the whole 2030 agenda. I really want to thank you all for being our panelists, and also to our lead discussant that we will introduce in a while. And I think it's because there's like 7 or 8 panelists. Each of you are going to have 10 minutes to present its issue. And then at the end, we will have time for a dialogue, a discussion, where we want to hear your how do you say, aportes, what you can really, and how you can really enrich what we are doing, or perhaps having difficulties, troubles in fulfilling and implementing SDG 4 in the different realities that we come from. Okay, is Mr. Garnier already here?
Yes,
our first speaker. Oh, glad to meet you, Leonard. Well, we are really honored to have Leonard Garnier, who is the most important person in the Transformative Summit of Education, which has just had its pre-summit, right, in Paris. And we are ready to listen to you, Leonard, to tell us everything we have learned till now about education transforming lives, transforming the world we want. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madeleine. It's really a pleasure to be here with you. Let's start by recognizing that during the first 2 decades of the 21st century, there was some progress in education in most countries. Budgets and enrollment rates increased, including for girls, but still, we were not even close to reaching the goal of transforming education into a true human right. Millions were out of school, and of those attending school, many were not even learning the basics. And then the world was hit by the COVID pandemic with devastating effects on education. This was the context in which the Secretary General convened the Transforming Education Summit, which is not a technical, but rather a political summit. Its goal is to galvanize social and political commitment to transform education so that we can really guarantee a quality education for all on this planet, as we had agreed in SDG 4. The summit, of course, does not start from scratch, but based on the abundant knowledge, research, and existing best practices. Neither is the summit an end in itself, but rather it pretends to be a turning point. It pretends to ignite a movement for the transformation of education that goes beyond business as usual, beyond doing things a little faster or a little better, and beyond merely recovering from the pandemic. We must aim higher. We must reimagine and transform education into a passionate and rigorous process of individual and collective self-discovery, self-development, so that every student has the best opportunities to flourish in every sense. I'd like to point out a few aspects of what do we mean by this transforming education. First, education must develop each student's capacity for learning the fundamental building blocks of knowledge. Here we're talking about literacy, numeracy, scientific thinking. These are essential for critical thinking and for our capacity to distinguish valid and well-supported arguments from mere opinions, or worst, as it's now very common, from fake, invalid, or unsubstantiated arguments. Second, education must enhance the lifelong capacity to learn and relearn the skills for the rapidly changing world of work, from its technical and organizational aspects to the fair and respectful managing of human relations. A third essential task of education is to develop our capacity and the values for learning to live together. This has to do with ethics, equality, and justice, with civic responsibility, democracy, and human rights, with the respect and enjoyment of human diversity, and of course, with our capacity and active commitment with sustainable development. A fourth and usually underappreciated role of education is that of developing our capacity to enjoy life and to live it fully and well. And this includes many of the most sublime aspects of the human endeavor, our creative potential, our aesthetical capacity to enjoy and to express ourselves through the arts, our disposition for leading a healthy life, our practice of physical activities, games, sports, as well as the pleasure of stimulating entertainment, our capacity for sharing this joy with others. In a nutshell, education should give every girl, every boy, every young or not so young person, both the ambition to expand their dreams and the capacity to make them real, the capacity to become the person they want to be and to participate in the creation of the world they want to live in. For education to reach such heights, we need other critical transformations in education. Of course, we must transform schools into inclusive, safe, healthy, stimulating learning places. Schools should not exclude anybody. They should accept every girl, boy, or young person and make them feel welcome, cared for, protected, stimulated, and supported. The school and its educational community must become the space and time of human integration, of our coming together in our rich human diversity without discrimination of any kind, mockery, abuse, or aggression. Teachers are a central actor in education, and teachers must also transform themselves, going from passive to active, from vertical and unidirectional to collaborative, from teaching answers to promoting learning based on questions and curiosity, from merely transmitting content to developing the capacity, the joy, the discipline for problem solving. Teachers should become the guides of their students' increasingly autonomous learning. This, of course, also means that teachers must be well selected, well formed, trained, equipped with the proper competencies, motivated, respected, and granted relative autonomy in their quest for excellence in their teaching. And of course, they should be remunerated according to the relevance and responsibility of their work. They should also be well equipped with adequate teaching resources. Sometimes they keep having the same old blackboard, the same old textbooks. Fortunately, we're living through a digital revolution, and digital teaching and learning resources could become one of the most powerful tools for transforming the way in which teachers teach and learners learn, as well as for democratizing education through expanded access. However, If not harnessed properly, the digital revolution could become instead a dangerous force for furthering educational inequality. The pandemic showed us both the promise and the peril of digital resources. Amid the emergency, digital technology allowed many schools and teachers to reach their students and support their learning. However, especially in low and middle income countries, many teachers and students did not have access either to the necessary equipment or to reliable connectivity. But access to broadband connectivity, access to the necessary gadgets is only half the story. The other half of the story has to do with the educational content and the teaching and learning resources that could be available through digital media. These are typical public goods because while they require a significant effort and a high fixed cost to be produced, then when they are produced, they can be widely used by an increasing amount of teachers and students everywhere with very little or no additional cost. If left to the market, such resources would become artificially scarce and quite expensive. That is why we must transform digital teaching and learning resources into global public goods so that their financing, design, production, and distribution is organized so as to guarantee free and open access to teachers and learners all over the world. And finally, of course, these transformations don't come cheap. They cost money. So we're also proposing in the summit something which is obvious, to invest what it takes to have a quality education for all, and to make sure that those resources are allocated equitably and used efficiently. The problem is that we have said this many times before, but we have not delivered. So the question is, why haven't we? And here we have to talk about unequal development and unequal educational opportunities. Today, educational opportunities and educational investments remain highly unequal, both between countries and within countries. According to recent data from the Global Education Monitoring Report, rich countries invest an average of $8,500 per year per school-age person, $8,500. Upper middle-income countries invest about $1,000, 8 times less. Lower middle-income countries invest just $275, and the poorest countries in the world are investing less than $50 per year per school-age person. So you go from 50 to 8,500. The distance is staggering. And within countries, we also know that from birth, the education opportunities of the children of higher income and better educated families are dramatically better, as their learning resources and their learning outcomes are also better, thus reproducing inequality. We must transform the financing of public education from a seemingly unsolvable expenditure problem into the most efficient and socially responsible investment we can make. There is increasing research which demonstrates the potential economic advantages of increasing educational investment. The rationale is very clear. No other investment has a higher private rate of return than education, especially early child education. Returns are even higher when we consider not just the private returns, but also the external returns produced by each person's education in the income and welfare of other people and the society at large. And then, as I mentioned above, we have all those other benefits from education, which, while they don't translate into simple economic returns, are essential for our individual and collective capacity for leading a good life together. So, if we know that investing in education is not only ethically responsible, but that it also pays more than any other investment, why is it that we just don't do it? The answer again has to do with the specific and different contexts in which educational investment occur. There is a very strong relation between the kind of development a country has and the kind of education, and that relation goes both ways. Putting it in very simple terms, when a country is highly unequal and has a large supply of very cheap labor, it can find itself in a low-level equilibrium, or more simply into a poverty trap. The type of investments mostly attracted by the abundance of cheap labor are typically unsophisticated investments with low capital intensity, low productivity, and little need for human capital. But still they can be very profitable. With no need for an increasing and qualified labor force, there is little incentive in such an economy for raising taxes in order to finance education, which is perceived as a mere expenditure. The situation can be even more complicated when countries, as happens very frequently, get entangled into the typical race to the bottom, where they deregulate the labor market to compete with other countries, they allow the exploitation of natural resources to compete with other countries, and they grant generous tax exemptions to further reduce the cost and attract foreign investment. As Emoglu and Robinson and many other researchers have argued, in countries where these extractive or low productivity economies prevail, the institutional framework tends to be weak, and the balance of economic and political power is significantly skewed towards the upper echelons of income and wealth, which again tends to oppose the kind of progressive tax increases that would be necessary in order to finance universal quality education. I was asked to talk today about the role of education as a sustainable development contributor to changing society and economic growth. Well, poverty traps and race to the bottom strategies are precisely the opposite of sustainable development. They are inequitable, they are environmentally destructive, they are economically inefficient, and they tend towards an anti-democratic concentration of power. But they are profitable both for the local and for the global elites. They constitute a perverse equilibrium, if you want. They are the main obstacle for the transformation of education into a true human right, an obstacle that we must overcome. Here, we should remember that historically, when we talk about human rights, remember that no human right has been graciously conceded. They all have had to be fought for. Education will not be different. Those who are being excluded from education, excluded from learning, will have to fight for their right. I said at the beginning that this is not a technical, but a political summit. Thus, if it is to achieve its goal, the summit will have to ignite a movement for the transformation of education. It will also be a movement for equitable, for sustainable development, and against poverty traps. Only then will we really transform education into a true and effective human right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Leonard, for a very inspiring speech that you have given us. I really appreciate the importance you have given to financing education. You have explained it in detail, and it really has to be thought thoroughly in order to achieve what we all want. A world without hate, without discrimination, without wars, without poverty, especially extreme poverty that we know millions of citizens of this world are living in. We are now going to start our different issues concerning education and how it can help for transforming education and transforming the world. In the first place, we are going to have Antara Ganguly. She is the head of the United Nations Gender Education Initiative. She will talk about equality and non-discrimination. And it's crucial for us to learn not to discriminate, because that is at the bottom of every single conflict that takes many times to awful wars in our world. Please, Antara, you have the floor, and 10 minutes. I'm going to be a little strict concerning the time because we are quite a few speaking this morning. Go ahead. We are all ready to listen to you, Antara.
Thank you so much, Madeline. And it's an honor to speak after Special Advisor Garnier. And I was so happy that you spent a significant part of your speaking comments talking about education as a human right. I think too often in working on SDG 4, we focus so much on just the right of children to be in school and to be learning how to read and count. And of course, that's important, that's central. But that is a small part of what education is. That is a small part of the vision of SDG 4, especially in the way SDG 4 was so thoughtfully connected to the other SDGs. I will speak today on education and gender equality, a little bit on education and disability. But let me start by sharing some statistics. In DHS surveys, the household surveys done by many governments supported by UNICEF, one of the questions that is asked to 15 to 19-year-old adolescent girls and boys is whether they think a husband is justified in hitting or beating his wife for at least one of the specified reasons, which are given as if his wife burns the food, argues with him, goes out without telling him, neglects the children, or refuses sexual relations. So these questions were asked to 15 to 19-year-old girls and boys in all the countries where the surveys are done. And here are some of the responses, and I'm just picking out some countries. All of the information is available on UNICEF's website. In Chad, 54% of 15 to 19-year-old boys and 74% of 15 to 19-year-old girls agree with this statement. In Indonesia, that's 32% of boys and 40% of girls. In Kenya, that's 37% of boys and 45% of girls. In Afghanistan, a country where all of us are so invested in getting children back in school and getting girls of secondary school age back in school, 71% of boys and 78% of girls agree with that sentence. And in Jamaica, it's 28% of boys and 17% of girls. Now, I'll give you a second to just think about what this means, right? These are children, these are 15 to 19-year-old young people who think that there are reasons which justify a man beating his wife. Incidentally, the survey does not ask the question the other way around, if anybody's wondering about that. Now, let me give you the opposite side of that. The opposite side of that is in ECW's documents on their website is a very, very interesting statistic. And this says greater education equality between male and female students decreases the likelihood of violent conflict, any violent conflict, by 37%. 37%. So this is the vision of education as a human right from a gender equality perspective. It's not just about getting girls in school, although I'll come to that in a minute, and that continues to be incredibly important. It's about using that opportunity of having those children in that space, in a platform, and helping them to ask questions like, why does my mother only sleep 5 hours at night? Why is it that my mother goes and works in the farm, as does my father, but when they come home from the fields, my mother also has to prepare the dinner and bathe the children, and my sister has to wash the dishes while I get to watch half an hour of TV or listen to the radio? It helps children recognize all of the gender inequalities that lead to conflict, that lead to inequality when we grow up. I think all of us who are here on this call, especially the women who are here on this call, have had experiences of being in workplace situations and other situations where you don't feel like you're treated as equal, where you feel what we talk about as microaggressions. Now, those boys, those 15 to 19-year-old boys who said in a survey that they think that there are good reasons for a man to beat his wife, do you think that they are going to grow up to be men who in a workplace are able to consider the women working alongside them as their equal? Do you think that they're going to be able to accept a woman boss with the same acceptance as they would a man boss? And now think about the girls, because I hope it hasn't escaped your notice that there were actually more girls agreeing with that statement than boys. We have known for a very long time that a boy who grows up in a household where there is intimate partner violence or domestic violence is 8 times more likely to become a perpetrator. And a girl who grows up in that household is twice as likely to become a target. Now, this is an interesting statistic too, because it does not mean that every child who grows up in a household with violence grows up to be violent. But what has not been explored, what we do not know rigorously with data and statistics, is what does it take for that boy who grows up in that household, for the girl who grows up in that household, to not turn to violence, to become egalitarian, to grow up to be an adult who is concerned with social justice, who is concerned with climate action, who wants to be empathetic, who wants to be collaborative, and who wants to work together with other people, recognizing everybody's individual human rights. That is the power and potential of education that we do not talk about enough. And that's why I just have to go back to what Special Advisor Garnier said, because he made so clear that the vision of education is not just numeracy and literacy, although that is core. I will repeat, that is absolutely core. If you cannot read and write, you cannot read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But it is also a space where we can bring together the resources of the education ecosystem to bring up the next generation of children to not be like us, to do better than us, not just at the macro level of not having wars, but at the micro level of households and firms and economies and communities. I do want to share I do want to take a little bit of time to talk about disability as well. Disability and gender are actually 2 of the most prominent factors of marginalization in education. And this is not a small number. 15% of the world's population lives with some form of disability. And as we speak more and more about invisible disabilities, I think we will all begin to recognize that just as gender is a spectrum, so is disability. Despite having the same rights to education as their male counterparts and non-disabled peers, girls with disabilities are the most excluded group of children from all educational systems. Global estimates indicate that only 42% of girls with disabilities have completed primary school, compared to 51% of boys with disabilities and 53% of girls without disabilities. So gender and disability are 2 of the dimensions of exclusion. There are many others which are locally contextualized. In some countries, it's going to be race. In some countries, it's going to be ethnicity. In some countries, it's going to be religion. And think about that child who has all of those dimensions of disadvantage: gender and sex, disability, being from a tribal or religious or ethnic minority. That is the child that we need to get into school. And guess what? That is the child who is several times more likely to have an illiterate father and mother, and certainly an illiterate mother, because the gender gaps in adult literacy are still so high. I'll end very quickly to say a little bit about UNGAI. We are the UN Girls Education Initiative, the only multilateral entity with this mandate of not just girls' education, but gender equality in and through education. We do programming and advocacy at local, national, and global levels. We're a feminist organization working with young feminist activists, civil society organizations, and governments to support ministries and citizens of the world to seek an education system that is more inclusive and recognizes more and more that education is a human right. Again, to go back to what Special Advisor Garnier said. Please visit our website. I'll just end with, I'll put in the chat, we recently, with 13 governments in Africa, came out with the Freetown Manifesto, which is a commitment made by these 13 governments and over 18 leaders of global organizations for gender equality in and through education. I'll stop there. Thank you so much for this opportunity, and I'm looking forward to hearing from the other panelists.
Thanks to you, Antara. Thanks to you for raising this very crucial importance for our or everybody's life, the great inequality between gender. I think the evidences that we gather from the surveys are really important because numbers say something. They can say a lot, and they help us to fight for our rights. Stressing the right to education means if the constant fight against women, gender inequality mainly. Okay, we're now going to have our Noel Aguirre. Noel Aguirre comes from Bolivia. He was a former deputy education ministry in Bolivia. He has a very long experience and rich experience in lifelong learning, in young and adult education. So he has many experience in proving how education can transform lives. So, dear Noel, you have the floor now for 10 minutes. And I thank Antara for being quite good at the use of the time. Okay, we are ready to listen to you, Noel.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Un saludo a todas las personas que nos están oyendo. Gracias a ustedes, Madeleine. Gracias a todas las organizaciones que están auspiciando este evento. Precisamente me voy a referir a un tema que me parece fundamental, que es el de la transformación en estos tiempos actuales. Este momento es un momento crucial en mi juicio. Es un momento definitivo para la humanidad, donde se está jugando la propia vida, pero además estamos en medio de unas crisis de múltiples expresiones. Uno puede hablar de lo sanitario, puede hablar del tema alimenticio, puede hablar de los valores, etc. Entonces, este es un momento donde tenemos que también repensar en el tema de la educación misma. Eso les pido, por favor, que me ayuden con la presentación. Está vigente, si pasamos a la segunda diapositiva, ahí por favor. Está vigente una pregunta que nos hemos hecho en la humanidad muchas veces y creo que ahora más que nunca hay que buscar las maneras de responderlas. ¿Para qué hacemos educación? Y básicamente unos tienden a transformar y otros a adaptar. Algunos piensan que lo que hay que hacer es educación para que los futuros ciudadanos de nuestros pueblos puedan incorporarse a la sociedad en las mejores condiciones posibles y puedan seguir preservando lo mismo. Pero en este momento de sindemia, inclusive más que pandemia mismo, en este momento de crisis civilizatoria, hay que pensar en el fondo en temas de transformación. Pasemos al siguiente, por favor. Y en esos temas, yo quisiera proponerles 4 elementos. El primero es el de la voluntad política para el cambio. El segundo, el de la educación para la vida, que me parece un tema fundamental de estos momentos. El tercero, lo que ya anunciaba Madeleine, educaciones a lo largo de la vida, pero no solamente educaciones a lo largo, sino también a lo ancho de la vida. Y el otro tema que yo creo que hay que comenzar a pensar es un plus sobre lo que es educación para la ciudadanía. Entonces, esos 4 elementos me van a servir para estructurar algunas propuestas que vayan en lo que es la Agenda 2030, pero también en lo que pueda ser un proceso de transformación. Vamos a la siguiente lámina, por favor. Si hablamos de la voluntad política para el cambio, desde Bolivia hemos aprendido que hay que hacer varias acciones, no quedarse solamente en lo que podría ser la lectura de un texto, de un libro, de una estadística, etcétera, sino nos parece que es fundamental leer críticamente la historia y el contexto. ¿En qué momento histórico estamos y cuál es el contexto que nos está rodeando? ¿Qué es lo que está pasando con nuestra humanidad, con nuestra sociedad? Es un tema importante. Segundo, nos parece muy importante que hay que revalorizar lo nuestro, obviamente sin dejar de analizar lo que pasa en el resto de los países, pero mirarse para adentro, ver cuáles son tus valores, cuáles son tus potencialidades, qué ¿Qué es lo que has desarrollado a lo largo de la historia y qué puedes contribuir para el cambio de la educación? Es un tema fundamental. Y aquí hay que combinar la mirada entre sabios y entre expertos. No es suficiente discutir entre expertos de educación, sino también hay que recurrir, por ejemplo, a los pueblos indígenas, a los pueblos originarios, a los trabajadores, a las organizaciones sociales, para que puedan emitir su punto de vista. Y obviamente hay que generar un proceso de concertaciones y alianzas, crear nuestras propias educaciones. Aquí está en debate si es que hay que comenzar a construir solamente un modelo de educación o más bien varios modelos de educación que puedan responder a las características de las poblaciones, de las culturas, de los pueblos, de las naciones. Y finalmente, como parte de esta voluntad política para el cambio, está el desarrollar una revolución educativa. En este momento no podemos hacer parches en el tema educativo, no podemos hacer medidas parciales, tenemos que ir al fondo de los cambios en términos educativos. Y hay un rasgo fundamental, a través de procesos sociocomunitarios participativos. Hasta el momento se ha mostrado, y uno puede analizar todos los procesos de reforma, de cambios en la educación, que no es suficiente, por ejemplo, tener una reforma por iluminación, donde existen unos cuantos expertos que dan las líneas y guían todo eso. Hay que proceder a procesos participativos. Tampoco es suficiente la norma, ni los materiales bonitos y didácticos. Todo esto es importante, pero es fundamental que los procesos de revolución educativa convoquen a la población e involucren en la toma de decisiones a la población mediante procesos sociocomunitarios participativos. Al siguiente, por favor. Un otro elemento es el de la educación para la vida, para vivir bien. Este momento, en la historia de la humanidad, quién sabe, es el momento más crucial para la vida, pero sobre todo para la vida de los seres humanos. Entonces, la educación tiene que comenzar a girar hacia un objetivo, hacia un propósito final, que es fundamental, que debería estar marcado por la vida. Este es un tiempo para preservar la vida. Pero ojo, cuando hablamos de preservar la vida, no nos referimos solamente a la vida de los seres humanos, sino de todos los seres vivientes que habitan nuestro planeta. Estamos hablando de las plantas, estamos hablando de los animales, estamos hablando inclusive de nuestras propias montañas. Y esta es una mirada distinta, hay que comprender una cosmovisión más allá de una mirada cerrada que se ha centrado en lo antropocéntrico, y hay que pasar a una otra mirada que es la biocéntrica, la vida de los seres vivientes es fundamental. Y no puede haber una educación que sea fundamental para este periodo si no mira esa educación para la vida. Entonces, hay que hacer una educación que pueda sostener un proceso de disputa contra el patrón civilizatorio occidental, colonial y patriarcal. Hay que comenzar a pensar de otra manera, así como estamos en este momento como humanidad, no es suficiente. Estamos en condiciones cada vez más difíciles y creo que la demostración de marzo del 2020 con la aparición de la pandemia fue una evidente muestra de lo que somos, de la fragilidad de los seres humanos. Por lo tanto, estamos hablando de una educación en la vida, de la vida y para vivir bien. No valen los simulacros, hay que comenzar a retornar a una educación profundamente ligada al día a día, al cotidiano, al diario vivir. Yo coincido en el sentido que no es suficiente solo aprender matemáticas, lenguaje, literatura, etc. Hay necesidad de aprender a vivir, a preservar la vida. Ese es un tema fundamental. Lo que supone también dejar de ser racionalistas y construir la formación integral desde una perspectiva más holística, donde puedan estar vinculadas todas las dimensiones del ser humano. No puede estar solamente lo cognitivo, la dimensión, por ejemplo, de la relación con otros seres superiores, sobrenaturales, la dimensión de la identidad, de los valores, de los principios como es el ser, la dimensión del saber recrear los saberes, no solamente los conocimientos, sino también los saberes, la dimensión de convivir y a partir de esa convivencia tomar decisiones y la dimensión de crear lo material y también lo intelectual y aquello no tangible es un tema fundamental. Tenemos que comenzar a pensar en una educación que vincule lo integral. No podemos quedarnos solamente en lo cognitivo y menos en lo racionalista. Pasemos, por favor, a la siguiente dicha. Por lo tanto, tenemos que pensar en educaciones y está de manera manifiesta, está lo de del plural ES, educaciones, a lo largo y ancho de la vida. Es fundamental un derecho a la educación. Inclusive diríamos el derecho a la educación más allá de solamente lo que se supone calidad, sino hablar de pertinencia cultural y de relevancia cultural, relevancia social. Si no tiene valor, no responde a lo que es nuestra cultura, a lo que son nuestros pueblos, a lo que quiere la población, ¿qué se puede hablar de calidad de la educación? Y si no tiene valor social, no tiene valor económico esa educación y no te permite poder vivir en mejores condiciones, no tiene sentido. Entonces ahí hay que comenzar a pensar sí en el derecho humano a la educación, pero en ese derecho que es pertinente en lo cultural y también relevante en lo social. Y esta educación, no únicamente aprendizaje en nuestro juicio, porque la educación es mucho más que aprendizaje, para todas y todos los seres humanos, independientemente de su edad, desde que uno nace hasta que uno muere, tiene que tener el derecho a la educación. Pero no es eso suficiente, sino en la humanidad habemos hombres, mujeres, unos que vivimos en el área rural, otros en el área urbana, unos que son trabajadores, otros que están dedicados a otro tipo de actividad, unos que tienen un test de color y otros que tienen otro test de color, unos que tienen opciones y otros que no tienen esas opciones. La educación tiene que ir ligada a esa diversidad y vinculada a esa diversidad. Por lo tanto, tiene que ser una educación a lo ancho de la vida. Eso supone también valorizar la educación comunitaria, la educación permanente, la educación popular, aquella educación que ha sido muchas veces ignorada y que ahora más que nunca tiene enorme valor para todo lo que puede ser. Supone también la complementariedad de saberes y conocimientos. No podemos quedarnos solamente en los universales y en los llamados universales y científicos. Hay que vincularlos necesariamente con los comunitarios, con los locales, con los populares, con los interculturales. Hay que hacer una interculturalidad de carácter crítica, donde se pueda hacer un balance entre aquello que viene de lo llamado universal y científico y aquello que viene desde nuestros pueblos. Esos saberes y conocimientos son válidos y esta es la hora de reconstruir y retomarlos y revalorizar. Pero también supone volver a lo que deberíamos una y otra vez entender. La educación no es sinónimo a escuela. La educación es mucho más en escuela. Entonces, hay que generar sistemas educativos mucho más amplios, mucho más abiertos, que no se queden solamente en un sistema escolarizado, en un sistema de educación formal, en un sistema de educación regular, que no tengamos ministerios de la escuela antes que ministerios de la educación, entonces podamos mirar más ampliamente. Y finalmente, les ruego pasar a la siguiente lámina, por favor. Una educación para la ciudadanía, pero una educación para la ciudadanía que sea plus, que sea mayor, que no es solamente vivir, desarrollarse en la sociedad, tener el derecho a la voz, etcétera, sino supone muchas cosas más. Por eso supone, por ejemplo, pasar de la educación para la ciudadanía hacia lo que es la educación para la democracia participativa, donde el poder se pueda construir con el conjunto de la población, comunitaria, con valores y principios propios de nuestras comunidades, intercultural, donde no solamente haya relaciones buenas entre los seres humanos, sino también se resuelvan las relaciones de desigualdad para contribuir a la construcción del Estado plurinacional. En otras palabras, una educación para el cambio, una educación para contribuir para construir poder social comunitario desde y con la población, para contribuir a la transformación de las injusticias, desigualdades y discriminaciones, es decir, aquello que en Bolivia se conoce como la pobreza material, social y espiritual. Muchas gracias.
Thanks to you. Thanks to you, Noel. Very interesting, very, very interesting approach to education. It reminded me a lot of the Delors report. Remember, we had forgotten for a while the 4 great pillars of education. And I'm glad that Leonard and you have brought them back into our memories. Now we are going to have Dia Niyawen. She is Executive Director of the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack. Very important and serious issue that we are all suffering in one way or the other one. Okay, dear Dia, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for the invitation and the opportunity to speak with you today and to learn so much from you. So we've heard very compelling accounts of the transformative power of education, and we know that education is key to achieving all the SDGs and economic and social development more generally, as well as ensuring the realization of the full panoply of human rights. However, as tenuous as the right to education is in many societies around the world, it's even more vulnerable and at risk in areas affected by conflict. Education Cannot Wait released a new report in June indicating that the number of crisis-impacted school-age children requiring educational support has grown from an estimated 75 million in 2016 to a colossal 222 million today. And the combination of conflict and the pandemic has had a devastating impact on education, as we know. For example, in Myanmar, the number of children out of school has more than doubled in 2 years, with about half of the country's children now missing out on a formal education due to COVID-19 school closures and escalating insecurity, according to Save the Children. A particular risk to the right to education in conflict-affected countries is targeted and indiscriminate attacks on schools, universities, and their students and staff, as well as military use of education institutions by both armed forces and non-state armed groups. The political commitments made under the SDGs and the Education 2030 agenda to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and to promote lifelong learning opportunities for all are at severe risk of not being met if education itself is not protected. SDG target 4A3 on the number of attacks on students, personnel, and institutions recognizes that these attacks can cause investments in SDG 4 to go up in smoke, literally and figuratively. GCP's Education Under Attack series is a primary source of data for this indicator, and the 2022 edition was released just last month. It found that over 5,000 reported attacks on education in cases of military use of schools and universities occurred in 2020 and 2021. Over 9,000 students and educators were abducted, arrested, injured, or killed in these incidents. Globally, attacks on education increased by 1/3 in 2020 from 2019 and continued at this high rate in 2021. Military use of schools and universities doubled in 2020 and 2021 compared to the earlier 2 years. In some countries, armed forces and non-state armed groups took advantage of vacant schools during the COVID-19 pandemic to use them as bases and barracks, weapons stores, training grounds, and even detention centers. Military use of a school can convert it from a civilian object into a legitimate military objective, putting it in danger of attack by opposing forces. Moreover, the presence of soldiers in schools increases the risk of physical violence, particularly sexual violence and recruitment. Militaries often take over the entire school, closing it down for students and resulting in many never returning to their education. For those who try to return, the damage and destruction caused to the school can severely impact the quality of education delivered. Even when schools remain open, when used by soldiers, the fear of violence often leads to a mass exodus of students and teachers. Girls and women are particularly impacted by attacks on education and military use of schools. Due to fear of sexual violence, amongst other reasons, they are usually the first to drop out and the last to return, increasing other risks, including early marriage, which further prevents them from returning to their education. Attacks on education sometimes take the form of or accompanied by sexual violence, creating multiple health risks and stigma that also prevents girls and women from continuing their education or their profession as educators. So in order to ensure that education systems in conflict-affected countries are more resilient and can also provide the protective functions that education offers, including safe spaces and routine for children and young people that are so important for psychosocial well-being and the ability to withstand the immense challenges of war, it's imperative to ensure that education itself is safeguarded. So how can this be done? In 2015, the governments of Norway and Argentina, in consultation and conjunction with many other states, NGOs, and international organizations, launched the Safe Schools Declaration, a political commitment to protect education during armed conflict. The declaration provides a comprehensive framework for doing so at the national level by calling on states to endorse and use the guidelines for protecting schools and universities from military use during armed conflict, which is a document that offers practical guidance to armed forces and non-state armed groups on how they can avoid using schools for military purposes during the wartime. The declaration also can ask states to commit to collect relevant, reliable data on attacks on education and strengthen monitoring and reporting systems, to provide support to victims in a non-discriminatory manner, investigate allegations of applicable national and international law, and prosecute perpetrators, develop and promote conflict-sensitive approaches to education, and ensure the continuity of education in conflict and support the re-establishment of education institutions. To date, 114 states have endorsed the Safe Schools Declaration, which is well over half of all UN members. By endorsing the declaration and implementing its commitments, states can go a long way towards better protecting education in armed conflict. And many states have done this. For example, in the Central African Republic, in 2020, the government passed the Child Protection Code, which criminalizes attacks on its schools and their occupation. This is the first piece of legislation in Africa banning or criminalizing military use of schools. The government of Nigeria in September 2021 released a national policy on safety, security, and violence-free schools and minimum standards for safe schools. In October of the same year, the Ministry of Defense launched the Safe Schools Declaration Trainer's Guide and Participants Manual for Nigerian security agencies and human rights institutions. In Palestine, to increase the protection of schools from military use, the Ministry of Education developed an action plan to be implemented at the school level. In Mali, in March 2020, the Safe Schools Declaration Technical Committee launched an action plan with concrete activities to disseminate the guidelines for protecting schools from military use and incorporate protection of schools and universities into national legislation. Indeed, about a dozen countries have modified their military doctrine or training to incorporate the guidelines for protecting them from military use during armed conflict. And these legislative and policy reforms are making a difference. The overall reported incidence of military use of schools and universities declined by more than half between 2015 and 2020 in the 13 countries that endorsed the declaration early in 2015 and 16, and that experienced at least one reported incident of military use. So what should be the priorities for states in protecting education? By implementing commitments within the Safe Schools Declaration, states can make progress towards strengthening the resiliency of education systems to prevent attacks or mitigate the damage when they do occur. Limiting or eliminating military use of schools is critical, not only to prevent recruitment, sexual violence, and other grave violations, but also to diminish the likelihood of the school being attacked by opposing forces. Use of the guidelines for protecting against military use should be a priority. Monitoring and reporting of attacks on education is one commitment in the Safe Schools Declaration, but it's also the foundation of all of the others, as it enables governments to keep track of the number of schools or students and teachers harmed, so that programs can be developed to support them and mitigate damage, and resources allocated to rebuild schools. It should also be a priority. As part of ensuring the continuity of education in conflict, comprehensive safety plans, risk reduction strategies, and early warning systems should be developed in collaboration with school personnel and the community, so that when there's a risk of attack, there are protocols in place about how to communicate with police, when to close the school down if the risk becomes too high, and how to provide alternative education programs, including distance education. There should be protocols also on how to respond to an attack when it's occurring so as to mitigate damage and save lives. Finally, programs and services must be available after an attack to rehabilitate schools as well as their students and educators, and enable survivors to return to their education, including in alternative forms, taking into account the specific needs of men and boys and women and girls and people with particular vulnerabilities, including disabilities. This planning and development of protocols ahead of an attack including in times of peace, are critical and should be prioritized. Finally, accountability for attacks is essential to serve as a deterrent and ensure justice for victims, and national governments need to do more to strengthen accountability mechanisms. This too is a priority. While each of these components in the Safe Schools Declaration on its own will play a part in better protecting education, ultimately, elaborating policies and strategies to address each of these areas and the interlinkages between them is important to create education systems that can continue functioning, even in the midst of war. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dia. Very, very much. Precisely the 10 minutes. And it has been really sad to listen to you because you have described so many ways that children and people in general can suffer from different kinds of attacks. It's really important what we have heard until now, the importance of learning to live together. That is learning how to convivir, as we say in Spanish. But it's a very, very hard issue in order to have every single country really assume the engagement when they sign a certain agreement globally. You have talked about the Escuelas Seguras and how many countries have signed that engagement. The great task is now to follow up how much of that engagement is really going to be implemented in our schools. As Garner said, we have talked about this issue many times. We have even signed documents in international legal basis to avoid this kind of disaster. But yet, many times we don't see that anything is changing in the countries that suffer the most from different sorts of attacks. Thank you, Dia, for that issue that you have brought up today, this morning. And now our next panelist is going to deal with an issue that has been brought up several times until now, which is tax justice for education finance. And we will have the pleasure to listen to Yandura Chipeta from Action Aid, one of the organizations that has done a lot of research on this task about how to increase the investments of education. So we have the pleasure now to listen to Yandura Chipeta. You have the floor.
Many thanks, Madeline. Tax justice is indeed key if we are to realize the human right to education, and particularly in relation to financing the education sector. Currently, globally, and even in low-income countries, we are seeing that we are falling far short of financing to the education sector in order for us to be able to reach Sustainable Development Goal number 4. And this is a challenge that is affecting each and every country. Despite that for the past 15 years, we have seen a growth or an increase in spending for education. However, we have not been able to reach or significantly invest in order for us to realize the targets that we set for Sustainable Development Goal number 4. And pre-COVID, there is an estimated annual expenditure of 200 billion that was needed for us to be able to be on track to finance and achieve the target set for SDG number 4. And this amount has now increased as a result of the complexity that has come upon us with COVID-19. And we also realize that in a lot of low-income countries, households are increasing their spending to the education sector, which is quite unfair, considering the fact that education is a human right and governments should be able to fund the sector adequately. A survey that was conducted in March 2022 highlighted that of 122 countries, only 1/3 have increased financing to education compared to the previous school year in 2021. And of the countries that had a closure of more than 20 weeks of schools as a result of the pandemic, only a few, actually more of them, have actually reported a decrease in the budget allocated to the education sector. So there are additional costs in relation to providing education as a public service in terms of the COVID pandemic, as countries have to ensure and governments have to ensure that the schools are safe and create that safe environment to promote learning. And the debt burden is also one of the areas where governments have been affected, and this in turn also affects resources allocated to the education sector. And we have seen a growing debt burden and a number of efforts were there during the crisis, particularly last year, calling upon governments, calling upon multilateral organizations to provide debt relief, particularly for low and middle income countries. And that only provided a cushion, but the countries remain highly indebted, and that is also affecting allocations of spending in the education sector, among other sectors like health. So there is need for us to take action in order for us to realize the right to education. And that action is only sustainable if we look at domestic revenue mobilization. Aid is important, and I think we have also seen during the COVID pandemic how countries also had to lower their commitments on ODA in order for them to also avert the crisis that they were facing in their own countries. So we saw ODA, that's overseas development assistance, decreasing over the period as a result of the challenge that was there. So there is need for governments to be able to look at taxation as the most reliable and sustainable, and also the most democratic way of financing the education sector and public services. Currently, the estimates are that according to the United Nations, countries need at least 20% of a tax to GDP ratio in order to deliver on the sustainable development goals, and that includes goal number 4 on education. But the low and middle income countries have an average of only 17% of tax to GDP ratio. So there is need for countries to take action on tax, and that should be done by increasing the tax to GDP ratio at least by 5 percentage points annually by 2030. And this would then help or cushion the governments to be able to double their resource allocation to the sector and spending on education. And there is need for countries to effect progressive taxes or what we call fair taxation, so that those that are earning more should be able to pay more. So by taxing income and net worth and also property of high net worth individuals and also organizations or corporates. And also, what we have seen work in other countries like Nigeria, Ghana, is earmarking taxes for education. So countries should also be able to earmark taxes and ensure that those earmarked taxes are indeed channeled to the education sector, and that would increase the revenue and resources allocated to the sector. There is also need to take action on tax incentives that are provided to multinational corporations particularly in low-income countries. The World Bank estimates that by reducing tax incentives in developing countries, there would be an increase of about 2 to 4% of GDP in revenue. So there is need for governments to be able to take that type of action to reduce tax incentives, particularly harmful tax incentives, in order for governments to generate more revenue. And that will also require multilateral action. So in order for us to address the problem on tax incentives, which has been fueled by a race to the bottom as a result of competition, international tax competition, if there is an agreement or a framework on international taxation to curb harmful tax incentives, that would reduce the tax competition among countries and would benefit countries in relation to revenue generation. Because the growth in multilateral or in MNCs, in corporates, investment in developing countries has not tallied with the corporate revenue or corporate taxation that is generated by developing country governments. So as civil society, we need to ensure that we generate evidence by undertaking research, policy analysis, and engaging with duty bearers like the ministries of finance, our governments, the Ministry of Gender, and also taking action through mobilization and alliance building by working with other civil society organizations through coalitions, and also influencing at regional and global spaces in order for our voice to be heard on what we seek and demand from governments as to the tax policy changes that need to be made in order for governments to effectively increase their revenue generation potential. And among some of the fiscal policies that we need to look at, looking at actions on the budget share. Already through the Indian framework, governments have the obligation to allocate a minimum of 15 to 20% of the national budget resources to education. So there is need to safeguard that allocation and ensure that it is indeed spent on education. And even though it may not be enough, the earmarked taxes would then come in to bring in more revenue. And there is also need to take action on the austerity measures that are employed upon developing country governments by multilateral institutions like the IMF. There is need to lift the public sector wage bill constraints so that we facilitate and increase budget allocation to the education sector, especially for countries that have teacher shortages. And in summary, increasing financing for education depends on increasing what we call the 4S. Number one, which is the size of the budget overall, and that is determined by progressive taxation and macroeconomic policies and trade. Two, the share allocated, the share of national budgets allocated to the education sector, increasing the sensitivity of the education budget allocations, ensuring efficiency and equity, and also increasing the scrutiny of education spending in education by tracking the resources that have been allocated to the education sector so that they reach the most remote and most vulnerable people in our countries. Thank you very much.
No. Muchísimas gracias, Yendira. Importantísimo lo que acabas de decir. Estamos completamente de acuerdo que lo mejor que puede suceder entre otras cosas, es que hayan impuestos específicamente destinados para la inversión en educación. Son muy buenos los ejemplos de Nigeria y Ghana, como has mencionado. Tomar acción es el llamado que hace Action Aid a la sociedad en general y especialmente a la sociedad civil, tomar acción para que la inversión en educación sea cada vez no solamente mayor, sino mejor. La equidad en la distribución de lo que se tiene como presupuesto para educación es muy importante y es una lucha constante, una otra forma de luchar contra las inequidades que hemos venido escuchando a lo largo de esta mañana. Muchísimas gracias, Yandira. Y ahora tenemos una voz joven a hablar de un tema importante. We now have a young voice. It's Eunice Linda. Yes, she's going to talk about digital learning. And we all know that has been a real change with the pandemic. Many schools were shut down and they were sort of obliged to have long distance learning. And as we heard from the beginning from Leonard, it has its very good profits, but it also has its perils. And we are going to learn, I'm sure, from Eunice, how we have to demand from civil society that connectivity is now a new human right. But I give the floor to Eunice. We are all ready to listen to you about digital learning.
Well, thank you so much, Madeleine. Thank you so much to the previous speakers, Antara, Leonardo, Chipeta, Dia, and everybody else that has made a great contribution. Indeed, education is a human right, and I would like to thank the organizers of this event for giving me, a youth, an opportunity to share as well what I think needs to be done to shape education going forward. Well, I was asked to talk about digital learning and education continuity, because we cannot talk about education and not talk about how we are going to ensure that every child globally is able to continue learning, even with pandemics or with future pandemics. Now, I'd love to start us off with some statistics. According to UNESCO, a third of students globally did not have access to distance learning at the peak of the COVID-19 crisis in 2020. Now, to many people not on this call, these are just statistics, like the many statistics printed out in books and hidden in the shelves. But to some of us on this call, these are real human beings with dreams. These are not just statistics. These are lives whose education was halted, dreams destroyed. These are people we should be thinking about when we say leave no one behind. Digital learning should embody and be guided by the principles of equality, inclusion, and equity. However, it's not lost on me about the challenges facing the actualization of digital learning in Africa and globally per se. So digital learning is faced by different challenges. I come from an African country, Uganda, and I've seen some members from Uganda on this call, and they can all agree with the fact that connectivity is a big challenge. We do not have electricity in some of these communities I work in some of these districts I work in, and it's difficult to talk about digital learning to a child in a community whereby they've never seen electricity, they don't even know how a gadget looks like, how a laptop looks like, how a tablet looks like. We need to think about these kind of communities when we're talking about digital learning and what we need to do differently going forward to ensure that they are not actually left behind. Issues to do with internet connectivity again. Uganda must be one of the countries with high internet costs, and the internet depletes so fast. So coming from a community whereby parents are still struggling to afford food. So when a child comes to a parent and tells them, I want money to buy internet, and yet they're struggling to afford food, the parent will think that you have a problem as a child. So the internet costs are very high. The connectivity challenges are quite overwhelming. It's so many learners were not able to access the learning materials from governments, the hard printed learning materials. So many girls with disabilities were not able to learn. So many boys with disabilities are not able to learn. There's a lot of challenges affecting the actualization of digital learning. Issues to do with inadequate learning devices. I was having a conversation with my auntie earlier. She's a teacher of primary, and she was telling me, we have 700 learners in my classroom, and only 30 gadgets. And she was asking me, how then will learning be effective if we have over 700 learners and then only 30 gadgets? You'll be causing more problems in the schools. Who do you give out? Who do you give a device to, and who don't you give a device to enable them learn? So these are challenges. The challenges to do with data protection and security. Ms. Antara is a great activist for gender equality, and oftentimes many girls face cyber harassment online. How are we ensuring that digital learning is protecting their data and that they're actually safe to learn in this space? There's a lot of challenges. There's a lot of bullying. There's a lot of cyber harassment, which has caused so many mental health challenges. So we need to ensure that digital learning is actually safe, that is protecting the data of the children and students. There's a challenge to do with lack of digital skills by both learners and teachers. The teacher-student ratio is high, and this is something we need to be thinking about. How do we ensure that the teachers have a number they can accommodate, they can follow up with, they can monitor to effectively ensure that learning is actually taking place and is actually effective? But I will talk about the role of teachers anyway in digital learning. I'm happy to have participated in the Transforming Education Pre-Summit in Paris, and there's a whole action track on teachers and teaching. But I want us to think about the role of teachers in terms of promoting digital learning. I mean, if we do not value teachers to invest in them, we are doing a disservice to this generation and the next. A good teacher, whether we like it or not, translates into a good student. Now, when it comes to digital learning, teachers play a fundamental role. I would call it, that must be the backbone of digital learning, because without a good teacher, then effective learning cannot take place. Teachers play a tremendous role in facilitating and guiding learners, whether it's inquiry-based learning, whether it is collaborative learning. Teachers have a role to play. Teachers play a great role in monitoring of learners to actually ensure that they are actually learning effectively, and that they play as well a tremendous role in mastering the methodology to ensure that all children in a classroom are actually learning, that there's nobody left behind. Again, I would love to talk about, I would love to give an example. I come from a community, again, where we have learners who have never seen technology at all, but we also have learners who have been able to see technologies. When you have all this in a classroom, as a teacher, you need to ensure that you have the best methodology that is accommodating all learners, that those that have been able to access technology before, that have interacted with technology before, are not leaving behind those that haven't. So teachers have a great role in mastering the teaching methodology to ensure that no child is left behind. But one of the points I need to stress out is that learning should be fun, and teachers have a great role to play in ensuring that the environment in which learners are studying is fun, is friendly, it's safe, playful, and appealing to learners, which is very, very important. But that said, I need to, now that I've mentioned about the role of teachers, I've mentioned about the challenges, I don't want to be that kind of young people, that young person that rants without giving solutions. I believe that young people have that capacity to derive solutions and the change they want to see. One of the things I think government and private sector should be doing to ensure that technology is actually accessible and is affordable by all persons. I think the government of Uganda and governments in Africa in general need to focus on rural electrification or find alternatives to electricity like solar transformers. I mean, we cannot talk about digital learning without connectivity. We cannot talk about giving out devices, phones. So what will the beneficiary use these phones for if they cannot charge them? So we need to focus on rural electrification, or if we cannot, we need to find alternatives to electricity like provision of solar transformers. The other thing I want us to talk about is governments need to employ a multi-sectoral approach. They need to partner and collaborate with civil society, with the private sector, with ministries of finance, because we need money allocated to digital learning. With Ministry of Gender, we need a gender lens into this. With Ministry of ICT to regulate the usage of technology and ensure that actually the learners are safe and actually learning effectively. So it is very, very important that we employ a multi-sectoral approach to digital learning. And the other, which is very, very key, is to train and equip both teachers and learners with digital literacy skills. And that should be through capacity building. And training the teachers should not be a one-off when the need arises. For me, I think we need to integrate technology in the curriculum during teacher trainings in the national teachers training colleges, so that we only don't train teachers when the need arises, but this is something this is a skill they acquire well in school, and when they get into practice, it is something they are well conversant with. I also need to mention that governments need to prioritize and invest in technology infrastructure, equip and resource digital learning spaces and centers with laptops, internet, and learning materials, and as well human resource. And how do we gauge that governments are actually prioritizing and investing in technology? We need to see this in national budgets. When you say you are investing in technology, we need to see this in national budgets, but we need to have strong accountability mechanisms to actually ensure that the money that has been allocated for in the budget to go to digital learning and transformation is actually going to that is actually being used for what it's intended to do. And that is the gap most African countries have. We have a lot of corruption, and we're not able as well to account. And this has affected the education sector tremendously. So we need to prioritize and invest in technology infrastructure and ensure that we have strong accountability mechanisms. I mean, we cannot talk about strong education systems without accountability. So this is something we need to invest in. Let's talk about the curriculum. The curriculum should be tailored according to learners' abilities. The national curriculum should integrate technology in the learning, integrate technology in the teacher training programs as well, and ensure that it is up to date. The world is struggling with different challenges, the climate change challenges, unemployment. So how are we ensuring that digital learning is creating an opportunity for us to address these challenges? I think that is very, very important that we think critically about and that governments should invest in. It is also important that governments equip government libraries with laptops and gadgets for learners who can't afford to access schools with these gadgets. I also need to mention that governments need to design integrated technology approaches and systems that are targeted and tailored to the users and learners' needs. The national curriculum, I need to emphasize, the national curriculum should include digital learning programs in the national curriculum design, and schools have to have the right tools, the right appliances or mechanisms to ensure that this digital learning is actually implemented. It doesn't make sense to have you give laptops or tablets without actually providing internet in these schools, without training the teachers, without setting up a gazetted place for storage, because storage of these digital devices is important. That's something we also need to think about, and it also falls under infrastructure. So as we think about designing integrated technology approaches, we also need to think about retooling these schools and ensure that the digital devices provided are actually put to the rightful use, but that they're actually safe. And then also government, through the Ministry of ICT, should regulate and ensure data protection. This is very key. This is very key. This is very key. The ICT ministry should regulate and ensure data protection, privacy, and security. Many young people and youth who are the main consumers of this technology and digital learning have fallen victims of cyber harassment that has led to mental health challenges like depression. So we don't want to have learners who are accessing digital learning but are actually depressed. So we need to ensure that ministries, especially the Ministry of ICT, is regulating. Then I happen to be one of the youth on this panel, and I want to re-echo our call to action. We did mention this well at the Transforming Education Pre-Summit during the youth consultation. They need to work with young people. They need to work with youth. We need intergeneration dialogues between young people and government on digital learning to facilitate knowledge sharing and learning. But it will also give the government and governments an opportunity to listen from young people's lived experiences. We are the main consumers of technology, so we know what needs to be done to address some of these challenges. So it is very, very important that governments, civil society, the private sector work with young people, plan with young people, implement with young people, monitor projects and programs with young people. I think that's the kind of partnership that will take us forward. That's the kind of partnership that will work. But it's not lost on me that the private sector has a role to play. And I want to highlight that as I conclude. Through the corporate social responsibility, private sectors can support schools with applications, design applications that are user-friendly, but also provide digital learning gadgets like the laptops, like the tablets, like the phones, to ensure that learners are able to access learning and that their education shouldn't stop going forward. What the private sector as well can do is to subsidize prices.
Time,
oh,
my dear.
The last point, I have quite a lot because I feel like we need to do so much to ensure that digital learning takes place. Thank you so much. But let me summarize by saying that the private sector needs to subsidize prices for computer tablets and gadgets so that governments can ably afford and provide these to the learners. And then finally, we need to finance education. I know this has been a song. It was a song during the Transforming Education Summit. It is still a song right now, but there's nothing that can take place without finances. So we need to finance education. We need to allocate budgets to digital learning. We need to allocate budgets to training teachers. We need to allocate budgets to purchasing these digital devices and ensure that no child is left behind and ensure that no child with disability is left behind. And I would love to conclude by leaving us with some questions to ponder on. How can we make technology more inclusive and user-friendly for children and persons with disability? And how can we make the online space safe and enabling for effective learning? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Eunice. Thank you. I understand your wish to say everything you have thought about today. Although you have concentrated in Africa, I must tell you that here in my region, Latin America, especially in the Andean region, children and also young and adults that were engaged in educational programs have suffered a lot because of this lack of connectivity. Your claim for electrification of rural areas, I think, is a universal claim, as it is now the universal right to access to connectivity. And I agree with you that we have to listen to young voices, because all these problems or benefits around digital learning, they understand them much more than my generation, for example. And for that reason, too, the Global Campaign for Education has invited a young lady from Mexico that is going to give us her reactions, her comments about all that we have learned in this panel. We will give the floor now to Guadalupe Diaz. She comes from Mexico, and we all know her as Lupita because we have heard from her several times in our youth activity. So we welcome now our Lupita Diaz to say what she has learned or think or react from all we have heard this very enriching panel. Okay, Lupita, you have the floor. Where is she? We were told that she was in.
Yes, she's in, Madeleine.
Está, pero no logra, creo, conectar su sonido. Veamos.
She's writing now.
She has problems with the microphone. That's what she says. ¿Estás segura que lo ha abierto?
Sí, madre, lo tiene activado, pero no.
No funciona. What a pity. No. Well, these are the problems I think we have all suffered, right? Either the camera doesn't work or microphone don't work, or sometimes connectivity fall down. That is, yeah, we have, there she is, perhaps. Let's hope.
Hola, buen día, ¿me escuchan?
Sí, Lupita, te escuchamos. Mira, no importa si no te vemos, lo importante es escucharte. Nos encantaría verte, pero si es un problema, ¿no?, de conectividad, entonces lo más importante creo es escucharte, ¿ya? Tranquila y te escuchamos.
Sí, me está costando un poquito.
Ahí estás.
Hola,
Listo.
mucho gusto a todos.
Hola.
Bueno, regresando un poco, me cuesta un poco entender, creo que es porque soy joven, ¿no? Todos estos problemas, el escuchar este bombardeo de ideas, me es difícil, ¿no? ¿Cómo existe desinterés hacia o esta lucha a estar pidiendo recursos, a este llamado a la sociedad? Pero claro, o sea, la lucha de la educación es parte de eso, ¿no? Buscar disminuir la violencia, la desigualdad, el acceso a la educación es complejo y lo veo acá en México. El acceso a las oportunidades cada vez son más escasas. Y también lo digo como mujer, ¿no? El hecho de poder acceder a una educación plena, a una educación igualitaria, el hecho de poder tener un trabajo donde me permita desempeñarme plenamente es complejo. Y son espejos no solo míos, sino de personas que vemos a diario. También como maestra lo he visto. Entonces, la perspectiva de la educación y lo que me ayuda con el hecho de que puedan compartir conmigo, pues es volver a redimensionar la educación, ¿no? Darle sentido y causa a lo que tratamos de hacer desde nuestras trincheras, este derecho humano a las etapas de formación, el aprendizaje a lo largo de la vida, a lo ancho, a lo largo, poder fomentar y revalorar el aprendizaje que cada persona lleva, ya sea por el hecho de yo sé hacer esto y lo puedo compartir a través de las comunidades, poderlo compartir con los pequeños, poder diversificar el aprendizaje, la transformación. Todo eso implica un proceso que para mí me es hasta cierto punto complejo entender, ¿no? Como mujeres también nos enfrentamos a esta intención del patriarcado, el hecho de que la mujer está de este lado, el hecho de que la mujer pues sí tiene accesos, pero los accesos son limitados y son sesgados, ¿no? La educación de alguna manera recae en los profesores y eso me preocupa, porque se le exige al profesor tener todo un compendio de habilidades casi extraordinarias, ¿no? Que de repente es difícil y complejo entender hacia qué habilidades nos debemos de enfocar si realmente los proyectos educativos, el modelo educativo, la reforma educativa está considerando que el profesor está haciendo más allá de lo que se está necesitando, más allá de un proceso administrativo. ¿Cómo es que vamos a replantear este sentido para que el profesor pueda contextualizar la educación, para que realmente tenga esta apropiación de currículum, ¿no? Ante sus alumnos, el poder tener esta formación del ser humano según sus vivencias, según la participación de la comunidad? De alguna manera tenemos desde un objetivo general, pues reconocer y respaldar a las distintas formas en las que se hace la educación, pero una educación emancipadora, una educación donde se esté transformando la capacidad del ser humano de poder extender su aprendizaje a lo largo y ancho de la vida. Entonces, escucho un poco lo que están diciendo y me es complejo pensar en que hay muchos profesores y muchos sectores sociales, formales e informales, donde estamos en esa lucha de poder emancipar, poder trabajar el aprendizaje, el tener estos medios de estimulación para poder seguir adelante es también complejo. Entonces, tanto como mujeres, desde mi trinchera puedo decir eso, ¿no? Es complejo entrar a sectores donde se siguen segregando, donde las oportunidades son bajas, donde salir a la calle es temer, ¿no? Donde doctoras, maestras, cualquier otra profesionista al salir de la calle es vulnerada. Y eso es importante y eso es complejo vivirlo. Y sobre todo luchar en las calles y tener que luchar en una profesión que estamos decidiendo día con día, es complejo salir. Y son diálogos que tenemos que aprender a darle un sentido, una escucha. Y agradezco a todos por escuchar y por compartir, porque siempre nos abre el panorama poder entender las realidades de los otros. Y empatar la realidad es compleja cuando la diversidad y la interculturalidad es demasiada, ¿no? Poder expresar cada uno de cada perspectiva me es complejo y trato de entender las realidades que vivimos día con día, pero sí se exige no solo al gobierno, no solo al Estado, no solo a organizaciones sociales, sino también se exige una emancipación social, cultural, para poder llevarnos a un nivel donde plenamente nos podamos desarrollar y participar activamente. Entonces, bueno, les agradezco esta participación y, bueno, disculpa por la demora.
Okay. Muchísimas gracias, Lupita. Muchísimas gracias por tu intervención. Could you please take out the image? Okay, thank you. Muchas gracias, Lupita. Lo que has dicho es totalmente cierto. Para nosotros, los viejos, también es complejo entender todo lo que involucra conseguir el ideal de una educación emancipadora que nos conduzca a transformar nuestras sociedades, el mundo, en un mejor lugar, en un mejor planeta para vivir, en una mejor convivencia entre los seres humanos, ¿verdad? Es realmente complejo. No te sientas mal. Al contrario, nos hace mucho bien tu sensibilidad, porque piensas en todos los aspectos que involucra realmente una educación transformadora, una educación emancipadora. Muchas gracias por tu intervención. Y ahora, we have some time still. We have around 20 minutes, and we would like to listen to you. If you have any thoughts and that you think can contribute to the different issues that we have dealt with this morning, you are welcome to take the floor. Okay? So you can just raise your hands. There is a little señal here. Reactions, when it says reactions, you can raise your hand there, and I'll give you the floor. No one? It seems that we are all thinking in every... is there Daniel? Somebody is showing some... Well. Ok. Bueno. Yo quiero agradecer muy sinceramente a cada uno de los panelistas que ha tenido la gentileza de compartir. Yes.
We have questions on the floor. I don't think you can see from Grant.
Oh, where? In the chat?
And his hand is up.
Who?
Grant's hand is up.
Okay. Grant, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you so much, Madeline. And thanks to all the panelists. I think this session has been very informative. So we really appreciate the discussions that have actually happened. My question goes to Leonardo. On the test sessions, we saw during the pre-summit that there was a declaration that was made, and we are seeing that the governments would want to recommit themselves, so that we're able to achieve the SDGs by providing really political commitments to it. My question goes to the mechanism that will monitor that, because I think in the past that there's been sessions where governments have been called to recommit, but what has always missed is the monitoring aspect of those commitments. So I'm not sure within the current test meeting that will happen in September, is there any thought around how will governments be monitored, or what will be the accountability mechanisms and structures that will monitor those commitments so that they are made, so that we don't again sit at the same spot where we are now, where we are saying we have to recommit again. Thank you so much.
I answered.
Yes, I was going to say, Leonard is perhaps the person that can answer your question, dear Grant.
Yeah, I think that the preoccupation that Grant poses is one we've had all the time. We've said many times that we will achieve universal education, that we will do this, that we will do that. I remember since Paulo Freire in the 60s talked about his new vision of education, we've been talking about that, and we move very slowly. We already have the goals established in the Agenda 2030. That the SDG 4 is a compromise that all countries assume to reach universal quality education, long life learning for all, but we are not getting there. The purpose of this summit is to convene the political support of the different countries, first of all, so that one of the things would be that they're going to the summit to say what is it, not what they did in the past, but what are they going to do to really reach the 2030 agenda goals. We will not reach like a new agreement or a new SDG, because we're still not reaching the one that we had established for 2030. But it's very, I think there are two things that for me are very important about this summit. One is that there will be like a follow-up mechanism very much linked with the high-level steering committee and the commissions we already have, that will have the results for the summit to do the follow-up after this. But I will say something else that I said at the beginning. These things will only happen if people in every country exert pressures for these things to happen. This will not happen by magic. I mean, let me put it this way, talking about a very specific topic, early childhood education. We have a lot of research showing that investing in early childhood is the best thing we can do. And still we don't do it. And when we ask ourselves, why is it that we don't do it? I have like two kind of explanations. The one I gave in my presentation is that when a country economy is based on very cheap labor and very extractive activities, that is not a priority. So what this means is that there is this relation between the need to transform education and the need to transform the economy. And the other reason is probably more selfish. And I will not talk only about the powerful or the elites or the 1% that we usually talk. I'll say something stronger. If you take the 30% of us who have the higher incomes and who are the more influential persons in our societies, we usually don't like to pay more taxes to finance the education of the children of the poorest half of the population. We have the problem of our kids solved. So yes, we talk a lot about financing education, but when they say, okay, we're putting this tax on the higher 30% to pay for the education of the poor children, then that's not that easy. So that the only thing that would change that, as had happened with women's rights, as happened with the civil rights movements in some countries, will be that those who are excluded from education, those who are excluded from learning, really demand education as a right. And our role here is to facilitate that participation. A summit will not do it. A summit can help to do it. But that's why I said that the summit has to ignite this movement for the transformation of education. This is a political topic, not a technical one.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much, Leonard. I totally agree with you. Totally. As you said in the very start, this is a political issue, the transforming education. And as political issue, it demands the action of people. It's our society where laws are issued by men and women. So we have the power to change those laws and regulations. Some might be fair, some others are not. But I do believe that it's in our hands to change things. And education, critical education, critical thinking mainly, is what is going to help us to achieve what we want for a better world and a better society. I think this panel, in a way, it has been a permanent call to action. That's what we all feel, a call to action. I'm going to stress what Lupita said, the young girl from Mexico, because she spoke not only as a woman, but also as a teacher. And definitely, we have spoken about digital learning for teachers as well. But my concern is mainly teacher training under the human rights approach. That is lacking. every single professional that has to deal with a direct relationship with men and women, people, has to study and prepare to exercise that profession under the human rights approach. No other person?
No. There's a comment in the chat session.
Okay.
Yeah, it says, I agree that transformation can only be done as a movement, and it has a direct correlation with the power structure and the political elite that rule the country. This can be changed possibly through mass mobilization. And it is from Javid Mirza. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, since there is no other reaction, that I said before, I think we are all very, very pleased with what we have heard during the morning from the different excellent panelists that we have had. And let's start thinking how to mobilize ourselves wherever we are from and whatever institution we are linked to. I'm really proud to be linked right now to the Global Campaign for Education that is really, really very much concerned about being a global movement towards the achievement of the right to education to be a reality, linked with all the other human rights, as we have stressed over and over again. Thank you to each of you, the participants that have been with us this morning, that I do believe has been a very enriching panel. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you, bye.
Thank you, bye. I think it has been a very successful meeting, and we are happy to be associated with everybody working towards transforming education for our learners. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bernard. Thank you, Bernard. There you are at the airport. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much to all of you.
Obrigado.
Okay. Oh, thank you to the interpreters too, please.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you very much. Good translation, at least that I've heard in English and Spanish.
Yes, great. Thank you, Madeleine, too. Thank you for taking the time. It was brilliant. Atlahang, are we still recording?
Yes, please stop it.
Hmm?
Yes, you can stop it.
Okay, so where do I stop this recording now? Oh. Okay.
Then we can end the meeting.
I can end the meeting.
Yes.
Thank you. Bye, everyone. Thank you, Madeleine.
Bye. Thank you. My pleasure.